Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out bright and early on a busy day, the day after campus stands too. I know people are out late, so thank you for joining us. My name is Steve Lubar. I'm the director of the Haffenreffer Museum of Anthropology here at Brown. We've pulled together for today's commencement forum a group of faculty and museum people who have used the artifacts in museums as part of their work. The order will be a little bit different. I'll be first. My day job is as a professor of American Studies, and I run the Public Humanities program at Brown, so I've spent a lot of time thinking about museums. For the last couple of years, I've been the director of the Haffenreffer Museum. Next speaker will be Emily Stokes-Rees, who has been the Postdoctoral Fellow at the Haffenreffer Museum for the last 2 years, with a degree in museum anthropology from Oxford. She's going on to a position at Harvard next year, so we're sad to see her go, but we're delighted for her for that new job. By the way, we are looking for another postdoc in museum anthropology if anybody has any connections. Elizabeth Hoover, who is not here yet, I don't think, but we hope will show up soon, is visiting professor in the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, a recent PhD from Brown in anthropology, who as a student spent a lot of time working at the museum, and who I'm delighted to announce has been hired next year as an assistant professor in American Studies. She'll be talking about some of the work she's done in the museum this year. And Sarah Ganz Blyth is the Director of Education at the RISD Museum of Art. She'll be talking about some of the work being done at the RISD Museum, getting students, getting faculty to use the museum. So let me begin just briefly saying a little bit about the Haffenreffer Museum. Some of you who've been at Brown for a long time may be surprised that the people who haven't been around for a long time may be surprised that the museum is now in Manning Hall. You'll probably remember it mostly as the campus out in Bristol. So a little bit of history here. It's been part of Brown for more than 50 years. We've been in Manning Hall since 2005. And in 2008, the Bristol facility, which had been open to the public, closed down. And that's become the Collections Research Center. So the Collections Research Center now is this idyllic looking campus on the banks of the river in Bristol. It's what used to be exhibition space has all been turned into storage space. So we actually have some wonderful, pretty good, not quite state-of-the-art, but close to it, storage facilities out there. I'll just give you a quick overview of, give you to pique your interest here, some of the types of collections that the museum has. One of the things that we decided we had to do when the Collections Research Storage Center became, as far away, we had to figure out a way to get students and faculty to use the collections, to let them know that they were available, to let them know that they were there for faculty and students to use. When you go into the museum, and I hope you'll join us after this talk, we'll walk across the street to see the museum. This is the door from the main green. New door there to attract a little bit of attention. And inside, to the right there, you see a couple of exhibitions. Some of them still on, some of them earlier in the year. This is the door from the quiet green. You can see there in the background the exhibition on Taiwanese indigenous art. And what you see when you come in on either side is this sign. This says what the museum's about. One of the things that museum people learn is to come right out and say what they mean. So it's a teaching museum. That's the key thing that we're saying. This is a museum that's used for teaching. We have 1 million objects. Many of them, as I put it, are objects only an archaeologist could love. We have lots of shirts, but we have a good 100,000 interesting ethnographic and archaeological objects, as well as the huge collections from Alaska. And what we do in the galleries, we present exhibitions from faculty, from students, from staff, and then we use the museum as a space for teaching. Give you a quick sense of the sorts of things, a quick overview. I mentioned before the exhibition I'll talk more about, done by graduate students, indigenous Taiwanese crafts. Down here, an exhibition on the Taoist art from China. You can see in the center there, interactive, done by students in the computer science department. An exhibition over here on Rhode Island Begins, curated by a faculty member. And then I'll spend a good bit of time talking about CultureLab, which is our new initiative. So, like I say, the first thing that we're eager to do, the thing that we're most concerned about at the museum is getting faculty to use the collections. That's really the goal. To become essential to a university, a museum has got to fit, it has to provide support for the core purposes of the university. It needs to be about research, it needs to be about teaching, it needs to be about learning. What we've learned, though, is that faculty, most faculty, outside of a few fields, don't know how to work with artifacts. People in art history, people in anthropology, people in archaeology, they're pretty good at it. The rest of the faculty, we have to work with them. We need to help them reimagine how they teach their courses. We need to teach them how to teach with artifacts. So what we do is provide easy access to the objects. That's the key thing. We've got to make it easy for faculty to use it. We've got to go out and tell them, they may not know it, but in fact there's good material at the museum that they can use. We have to work with them. We bring the objects to their classes, we bring the classes to the objects, and occasionally we've sat down and co-taught courses with faculty, either individual class sessions or occasionally the entire class. So I mentioned faculty exhibitions. This is an exhibit called Rhode Island Begins. It's no longer on display. Done by a faculty member in American Studies. Class exhibitions is something we've put a lot of effort into recent years, and in fact you'll hear today two more extensive class exhibitions. This was one from last year called Exquisite Things, based on the notion of exquisite courts, the surrealist game. And it's interesting, it's not only a class exhibit done, each student did a piece of it, but done not in the museum proper, but over in the Roberts Student Center. And done in a sort of imaginative new way. You'll see in the exhibition at Manning today as well, letting students add labels on the outside of the course, outside of the cases. So some outlines, some ways that we try to make it work for class exhibitions. First rule is make it easy. The clear guidelines are essential for having a class produce an exhibit. Exhibits are complicated things. If you don't make it clear what the schedule is, how many objects are allowed, how long labels are, very clear schedules, all of that's important. Narrowing the options. And so for most classes, what we do, we're still working out the details of this, we say, these are the templates. Students should write to these guidelines. This is what the main text will look like. This is what object text will look like. Only so many words will fit onto these, into these templates, and that helps to guide the exhibit. Beyond teaching with exhibitions, just teaching with objects is a clear way that faculty and students get to use the collections, get to use the objects. Terry Jentz is here, the museum curator, working in this case with students from the Risley Museum at making a jewelry class, coming to look at examples of adornment in the collections to inspire their own work in jewelry making. This is actually Liz Hoover's class. Terry here talking to the class about Native American artifacts in the museum. This is in CultureLab. Beyond working with faculty, though, we also work directly with students in a wide range of ways. And this is really what we're, again, trying to get more and more students involved. So there's undergraduate student exhibition projects. Exhibit from last year, Children's Day, done by the undergraduate student group. In CultureLab, we have space for small student exhibitions. This is this year's student group project called Shoes Have Soul. They wrote the labels, they chose the objects. One of the advantages of CultureLab is that it's easy to do quick changing exhibitions. Graduate student group last year did an exhibit on an anthropologist's view of brown students, called Seeing Ourselves, Showing Ourselves. It was an interesting and controversial show a little bit. And a group of undergraduates and graduate students working together did an exhibit that's open now actually at the John Nicholas Brown Center, the Public Humanities Center, working with a group of Guatemalan immigrants to the U.S. in New Bedford who are weaving traditional style clothing and not so traditional style clothing, working with a student, an undergraduate student who's a clothing designer. That's still open. Welcome to go see that this morning if you're interested. I mentioned before the Taiwan Aboriginal craft exhibit, Crafting Origins. This is a graduate student in anthropology who did this as a part of the dissertation. Based on the work she did for dissertation, the museum gave her funds to acquire artifacts in Taiwan as part of her fieldwork, and then they were put on exhibit as part of the exhibit she did. We have an extensive program of education at the museum, working with middle school kids, and now a new program actually with preschool kids, 4-year-olders, and their students in the public humanities program who are interested in museum education have worked a lot with those programs. I mentioned student collections. Actually, this is another student exhibition done last year about the history of students collecting at Brown, some of the objects they collected, some of the stories that they collected. We've had students working in the collections, doing back in the back of the house of museums, in this case cleaning mold off of art objects. Not as exciting, but important. And let me just say a bit about CultureLab, which is our new signature project. CultureLab, this is to give you a sense of what Manning Hall looks like inside. What we've done is taken about a quarter of the space here and turned it over to a space explicitly set for teaching and learning. This is the poster that you still see around campus. We're still advertising it. Explore the museum's objects, discover the objects, the cultures of the world, learn about the work that archaeologists and anthropologists do. What we've got in CultureLab is a group of student assistants who are there to help you when you walk in. We have a lot of objects that have been chosen for particular classes. Here, a class on the automobile, a class on Mesoamerican archaeology. The objects are there. Some of them, like these that are fragile, can't handle, but there are many objects that in fact can be handled. Here's Liz showing off for her class some of the objects that she used. Christoph Hoover, thank you, never get his last name right, visiting professor in archaeology, did a wonderful exhibition, a class on money, history of money. It turns out anthropology museums have lots of things that have been used as money. So you can actually see those, many of those are still on exhibit in CultureLab or available for use. Oftentimes, faculty would assign students to come over and report on objects, write them, draw them, examine them, and that's something you can do. Again, from Liz's class, looking at objects in the CultureLab. We've also started a new experiment called cataloging in public. Mostly what museums do to catalog their collections is done off-site. It's the back room. You don't see it going on. But it turns out it's a very good educational tool. Here's Kevin Smith, the deputy director of the museum, cataloging some of our many, many tens of thousands of projectile points. We've also had students from archaeology working on some of the ancient collections in the museum. There's a collection of Loristan bronzes that the museum has that we've never really fully understood. And now we have a student who's doing this as part of her work in the archaeology program. I mentioned before the Guatemalan textiles. Really the perfect exhibition collection project for us. We have a large collection of textiles from Guatemala given to the museum in the last couple of years, some 600 pieces. We have 2 students who are cataloging it in public, and then they were responsible for the exhibition that's going on now, and sort of the perfect combination of projects for a museum. We've done some studies of what students think about this. Mostly, we've heard very good things. The notion that you can actually go and handle things in the museum, learn something new by working with objects, has been very well received. There's still more studies to do. And finally, let me just end by some little bit talking about where we're going next with the museum, how we reorient the museum. museum studies, people like to talk a lot about reflective practice, that is thinking about what the museum is, what's going on. And so you'll see if you go over there today an exhibition called Facing the Museum about the history of anthropology museums. These are plaster casts from the Races of the World exhibit that was at the American Museum of Natural History about 100 years ago. We've reached out beyond the building. This is in Rockefeller Library, exhibition done by 2 graduate students on totem poles in the Pacific Northwest. We've let go a little bit and tried to reach out to new audiences. This is an exhibition on Haitian voodoo done with the Africana department, but also done with a voodoo priestess, somebody who came and built us an altar that was actually used as a voodoo altar in the museum. Those are all of the things that the museum has been trying to do. Again, thinking about all the ways that we can be useful is really the main goal for the museum. So let me end there and introduce our next speaker, Emily Stokes-Rees.
To grab one of these bottles of water. I apologize, I'm recovering from a cold and I'm in the dry throat stage, so we'll be sipping. So as Steve said at the beginning, I've been working sort of partly with 3 places, partly with the Haffenreffer Museum of Anthropology, partly at the John Nicholas Brown Center with the public humanities students a little bit, and also with the anthropology department. And over the last 2 years, part of my job description has been to try to get faculty and students, but mainly faculty from different departments, the anthropology department and also others across the campus, kind of re-engaged with the museum and thinking of objects and museum collections and sort of the histories and stories held within museums as a really valid source for their research, to inform the research and their teaching. And we've had some success in various areas. It's been a challenging couple of years, but I think with the project Steve just outlined, we're really kind of making big steps forward. And in my own teaching over the last couple of years, I've sort of tried to practice what I preach and have my students use objects in my class. This past semester, I taught this class, the materiality of history, actually in CultureLab. Every week we met in CultureLab. And through the various topics, it was sort of a wide-ranging material culture-based course, looking at it sort of from the perspective of an archaeologist, an anthropologist, historian, and looking at different approaches to how one can use objects. And through the course, we looked at different objects. As an example, for 1 week we talked about fakes, the issue of authenticity, and is an object that is a fake or a reproduction actually a valid historical source? Is this a source of information that researchers should be using? And we looked at different objects that the museum has, where one is real and one is fake, and sometimes it's very, very hard to tell, and it was great fun, basically sort of playing guessing games through the class, trying to figure out which ones were really real and fake. But what I want to talk about today, specifically regarding this course, is 2 assignments that we did that just sort of show the possibilities of working with objects that people could use in their teaching. And in this course, we had a huge amount of fun. So the first was this is again, Steve showed earlier, a picture of an exhibit called Exquisite Things that's in the Student Center. This is what it looks like now, or as of just last week. And this exhibition is called What Do You Think of This? Objects Across Disciplines. And we have here, in the 4 corners, we have 3 boomerangs from Queensland, Australia. Down in the bottom corner, that is an Egyptian mummified ibis. This close corner, these are, and I'll let you decide which is which, a husband and a wife discipliner. from Peru. They're Caxinawan. And in the top corner, that is a Melanesian penis sheath. And what we did was the students, we had chosen the objects. They're objects that I don't believe have been exhibited before, or at least recently at all. And obviously don't really go together. They're sort of 4 random groupings of objects. And the students were assigned to pick faculty from across the disciplines, and I really challenged them to, go find a physicist, which we did, who talked about the boomerangs. Get people from as many disciplines as you can, and to interview the faculty about the objects, and just to find out about how they would approach thinking about the object, how they might use it in their class. So as you can see, it's a busy exhibition. That has lots of little text panels with quotations from the different faculty. And we have, as I said, we have a physicist talking about the boomerangs. We have a medical faculty talking about the ibis, a professional artist talking about the penis sheath. So across the disciplines. And they submitted quotes, which became our text panels. So this is, it was a challenge, sometimes actually chasing down the faculty and cornering them to get them to actually cough up the text was a bit of a challenge, but it was really fun. And all of the faculty commented afterwards that it was actually a really interesting exercise in thinking about, they've never actually considered thinking about these objects before. So that's really good. And if you're passing through the Student Center, please stop and go see it. It's just on the lower level at the bottom of the stairs. You can't miss it. And then our final assignment for the term, which I literally just last week finished marking, was a garbology assignment. That is apparently actually a proper term. And my students were assigned to look at this is a picture of it, one bag of my own family's trash for a week. Now this is minus recycling and anything perishable, because it was sitting in my office for about 6 weeks. So I didn't have anything that was going to start to smell. But the students were given this bag of trash, and basically I kind of gave them a pretty kind of wide range of ways that they could approach this. And the results, the reason I want to talk about this assignment is the results that I got were absolutely fantastic. I think it's the best set of papers I've marked so far in my short teaching career. And so I just wanted to share with you a few of the bits that I got, which were especially fun. So I had one student in my class who was actually an engineer. And interestingly, he thought this was absolutely fantastic because he's actually a materials guy. And he decided to look at the plastics and to analyze. There were a lot of things in the garbage that were sort of plastic bags that held pasta or oranges or a bag of apples, or there were lots of that sort of thing. So he made this list of sort of different kinds of plastics in these various different categories, whether it's recyclable or not, and what the origin of the plastic was. And he sort of points to this idea of plastic. He says, down at the bottom quote, it says, from appliances to clothing, from containers to the microencapsulation coatings that sustain the release of drugs, plastics are a game changer. More importantly, they change how we eat our food and when we eat our food. The shelf lives and ease of transport of many foods are increased with plastic bags and containers, enabling globalization. So this was the approach he took. This was completely unexpected to me, but I thought it was just great. And he had these maps, so this was that he plotted where all the plastics in the garbage were from, both globally and within the United States. And then sort of went on in his paper to kind of analyze what this says about sort of modern society and how our food ways have changed and our consumption of plastics has changed. This was not at all what I was expecting, but from an engineer, this assignment became really relevant for him. And anyway, it was very surprising and fantastic. Another student who is graduating this weekend. She took the role of the sort of innocent archaeologist, and she, to the extent, innocent enough that, so she was writing in the year 5099, and you can't see it, but she actually made up her sources, which was absolutely brilliant. So she was quoting and citing completely fabricated sources from 5099. So when Best Buy, Sell By expires, Obsessions with Food Spoilage in the 20th and 21st Centuries by H. Glossop. And so she was quoting all these different works, and she viewed herself as an archaeologist as finding this bag of garbage and trying to pick apart, you know, what she could figure out about the society. She had a brilliant, you see the 3 coffee cups here, she had a brilliant section on compulsive coffee drinking and the use of drugs, and, you know, and trying to make speculations about who lived in the house, by the sock, which is up there, and there were also, in the garbage there were a number of pieces of my children, I have 2 daughters, my children's art. And so I mean, her interpretation of my children's art was just absolutely brilliant. So this was another approach. And then finally, the last one was a public humanities graduate student who took on the role of, she was the curator of collections at the Haffenreffer. And she was making the case, which you can read here, she's making the case that this bag of a university professor's garbage should be accessioned into the museum's collection. And she went through, you know, a very long rationale, picked out kind of 6 key objects, you know, one of which is the deodorant container, sort of thing, to make her case that these are really important objects for a museum to save, because they chronicle the lives of university professors. You know, she makes the argument at one point in her paper that, you know, university professors often have a bit of a reputation of being, you know, sort of anti-establishment and sometimes a little quirky and eccentric and that sort of thing, but that actually from studying these objects you can see that, you know, we are very much in the modern world and, you know, use the modern world's objects. So my point of showing you these is just to show you that I had 6 students in this class, and this is just 3, but with one bag of trash, I got 6 completely different approaches, different papers, incredibly creative, and very well thought through and argued. Papers all using material culture, and these sort of weren't even museum objects unless Steve might decide to bring them into the museum's collection. So yes, that's what I wanted to share with you today, just a bit from my class. And the CultureLab, which I hope, as Steve said, many of you will come over to see afterwards, is just an incredible new resource and space for faculty to use in the museum, and I hope that it will have a wonderful future. Thank you so much for coming out this morning.
So the reason I was trying to sign into Facebook in the middle of my talk is that it actually played into the exhibit that my students set up this semester. So if anybody's interested in seeing the Facebook site that they used, I can link you up with that. But I had the unique experience of somebody teaching at Brown who was also a student at Brown. So I did a master's in museum studies back in 2003 here at Brown, and then got a PhD here, and then went on to teach at other places, and have now been hired back at Brown as an assistant professor in American Studies and Ethnic Studies. And so when I came back, most of my focus is environmental justice in Native American communities. But because I had this museum experience, they said, we would also like you to teach a museum studies course covering Native issues. And I said, sure, because I had wonderful experiences as a student with the Haffenreffer Museum, and also somebody who worked on the exhibits here. So I used the museum not only for my museum classes, but also in my Native American Environmental Health Movements class, which you wouldn't intuitively think as a class that would utilize museum objects, but part of what I was trying to convey to my very multidisciplinary class was that if you're going to go and do research in other communities, you have to learn about the culture of those communities. And so in talking about contamination and health issues at Akwesasne, which is a Mohawk reservation on the New York-Canadian border, as well as the Navajo Reservation, where they had a lot of uranium mining, and then the St. Lawrence Island Yupik in Alaska, in addition to talking about the environment and health problems and studies there, we looked at the material culture of each of those places. And so as part of that, the museum staff were able to bring in objects to say, okay, this is how you would get to know the Navajo culture, in which silversmithing is very important and weaving is very important. And they were able to become familiar with objects from those different regions, in addition to talking about the environment there. And as Dr. Stokes-Rees mentioned, I hope you'll get over to the Manning Gallery, where my students for the class that I taught this semester, the Thawing the Frozen Indian, American Indian Museum representations, set up an exhibit as one of their final projects. And the reason we chose that title was part of what the class was aiming to do was to get students to recognize that Native people have not always fully appreciated museums because of the way that they've sort of frozen Indian culture at a certain point in history, and the way that now a lot of Native people are trying to use museums to rework that image. And so we started the class talking about how people used museums throughout the 19th century to create this image of the other. And so as part of that, I brought in things including beadwork, so a lot of Haudenosaunee or Iroquois beadwork from the 19th century that showed these beautiful things that people were collecting from these exotic other people, in addition to a lot of clothes. And so what we found was in trying to display Native American culture, people were looking for the beautiful as well as the look at how terrifying and savage these people are kind of objects. And so those are also on display in the CultureLab, if you want to step over there and see that. And then in addition, we also talked about what is in the Haffenreffer's collection. What is it that Rudolf Haffenreffer and his contemporaries were collecting as a way of trying to display these disappearing people that were Native Americans. And then beyond that, we also looked at 20th century responses to museums. So how is it that Native people are speaking back against some of these collection practices that were a way of trying to document these disappearing people, and now Native people are saying, no, we're not disappearing, we're still here, and we're interested in displaying ourselves in a slightly different way. We also talked about repatriation, which hasn't been as much of an issue for the Haffenreffer as it has been for some other museums that contain a lot more bodies and grave goods. But we talked about what it means for museums to have to now start thinking about giving back some of these objects that people collected. And as part of that, one of my colleagues, Honor Keeler, who was actually also a student here, she's from the Cherokee Nation, and is now a lawyer, and she has started an international repatriation project. And so she's actually started going to museums over in Europe and looking at their collections and saying, where are some of these objects from, and in what ways can she connect Native nations here in the US with some of these collections so that they can at least be aware of what's in these different collections overseas. And so some of my students opted for their final project to do some work with her and kind of looking at some of these online documentation of those collections to say, how can they help her to inform Native people of what's in these museums. We also looked at tribal museums, and so we took a nice field trip down to the Pequot Museum. If any of you haven't been there, it's a really interesting trip, and I recommend that you take it. And so they got to have a look at these museums and contrast those to some of the ones we read about. A lot of tribes don't have as much money as the Pequot do, and so that's sort of an exceptional tribal museum. They're sort of looking at how tribes are now trying to take the institution of museums and examine how they're going to represent themselves through these museums. And we also looked at living history museums, and so we had a speaker come in from Plymouth Plantation, from the Wampanoag Indigenous Program, and talk about how it's a little bit different, how you're thawing the frozen Indian when you're standing there talking to visitors, and how that's also difficult when you're talking to visitors wearing a breechcloth because you're supposed to be representing the 17th century, but at the same time trying to convince them that tribal people are just as contemporary as they are. And so what are some of the challenges around that? So for the final exhibit, I said, all right, students, we've been talking about how do you represent Native people as contemporary as facing all of these issues, you know, looking at some of the writings that Native people have put out there about museums and come up with an exhibit. And so some of them were a little terrified at first because they had been reading all of these things all semester about the problems that Native people had with museums. And I think in teaching this class again, I would try to highlight more that, yes, there are some uses to museums, and Indigenous people recognize that, and museums can be good too. But so this is why I was trying to pull up the Facebook site. But what they decided to do was talk about sort of the appropriation of Native images in contemporary American culture. So that's one of the exhibits that's over in the gallery right now, is looking at how, you know, one section is on what they call kind of clearly racist appropriation, and so the Haffenreffer used to have this very extensive collection of cigar store Indians, one of which is over there, as well as our dear Dr. Seuss also drew a lot of Narragansett beer ads for Haffenreffer, who was the founder of the museum, who also produced a beer. And so there's a sort of Indian in all of these illustrations that he did to try to promote his beer. And then kind of stepping beyond those images, they looked at how the appropriation of Native culture in contemporary clothing items. And so some of you may or may not have heard about how Urban Outfitters was sued by the Navajo Nation because they were selling Navajo print panties and flasks that had these coverings that they said looked very Navajo. And the Navajo didn't appreciate their name being put on undies and flasks that they weren't even getting any money for. And so those are part of the exhibit, put in juxtaposition to actual Navajo weavings, as well as a t-shirt from, I think it's Forever 21 that has a breastplate on it, juxtaposed to an actual breastplate. And one of the American Girls dolls, who's supposed to be Nez Perce, juxtaposed to a Nez Perce doll from the 19th century. And what they did with the Facebook site was to invite a lot of Native people out there to come and comment on some of these objects and say, you know, how does this make you feel? What is your opinion on this object? And then they incorporated those postings into the exhibit as part of the labels. And so that way they felt like they weren't speaking for Native people, they had invited Native people to come and speak on those objects. And then the third section is Native art that has sort of, in a strange way, appropriated a Western form. And so there's beaded sneakers, or there's a big pendant of Chief Wahoo from the Cleveland Indians. And so it was sort of a way of Native people's art reappropriating this Western form. And so those were the three sections that are over in that exhibit. And then they used markers so that people could write on the glass outside of the objects to talk about how these items made them feel. And so it was a way of trying to get the audience engaged as well. So again, I hope you'll stop over there and see some of the exhibits that we have on display in CultureLab, which are much more of the traditional museum objects versus the objects that my students chose for this class, and in some cases purchased for this exhibit, which were much more about trying to examine this contemporary American phenomenon of appropriating Native images for style. So, and if you have any additional questions, I will be here. Thank you.
So thank you so much for sticking to the very end. It's my pleasure to represent some of the work that RISD does with Brown, and particularly within the RISD Museum. And I think what's wonderful about the presentations that came before is it just attests to the power that objects play in teaching and learning today. And what I'm actually showing you here is a print from the 1750s by Sebastian Leclerc. And here he's imagining what the academy might be. This is very much an Enlightenment image. He's imagining the arts and sciences being taught through and with objects. And so this is rather a utopian image, but I would argue that it's very much part of the way in which we work today. And with the founding of the Louvre later in the 18th century, one finds this kind of concept institutionalized, if you will. So the Louvre here, this wonderful painting by Robert Hoover from 1893, shows both the public and artists learning from objects in a museum. And in this example, artists are becoming or learning in the public. They're performing the act of learning. And this I would argue the Louvre was very much about making objects public to all, and really, one can say, the first museum with an educational program, the idea that the public could learn from objects. As the 19th century progressed, a new model emerged, and that was the one that was represented by the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851. And what emerged from the Crystal Palace exhibition is that the UK was really trailing other nations in terms of its industry, and a museum would help them improve. And basically the idea was that if you saw good art and design, you would make good art and design. And in fact, when originally called the Museum of Manufacturers, which we now know as the Victoria and Albert Museum, was established, that was the very concept. If one just saw great things, then a nation would start to create better things. And this is the model that actually impacted the development of museums and higher education throughout the United States. So when we look back at images of the RISD Museum, this is actually in 1915, this was the thought. And the mission of RISD was threefold. One is to educate people to enter trade and manufacture, to educate artists and art teachers, and finally also to educate the public. And so I hope what becomes obvious is this sort of idea of increasing the economy, increasing the betterment of society, and to create artists. So this sort of three-pronged notion. And I think the question we often ask ourselves, and a question that Steve and I always come back to in conversations we have is, so what's the role of objects today? What is the role of objects in higher education? And particularly, how can we best facilitate students' learning today? And one thing that we often acknowledge, and I think it came up in both of the presentations that came previously, is that students need help, as do most visitors to museums. We don't necessarily have the navigational skills, the decoding skills, to be able to make sense of what we're seeing. And so what we've started to notice is that the relationship between students and museums is a progressive one. In other words, it might not be the same from your first day at Brown to the role a museum would play in graduate school. And so I'd like to just show you about how we've been thinking about this progression and give you some very specific examples. So it might start out with a faculty member facilitating that experience, basically modeling the ways in which one might decode a work of art. It might then progress into some deeper look into storage. And you're seeing here Brown students looking at our Gorham silver collection. It will be assignments where one writes about a collection, but also enacting very old ways of learning from collections. And here are students copying in the galleries, just as you saw artists copying in the galleries in the Louvre. So these ways of learning from objects are ones that sometimes are very old, but ones in which in the act of copying, one could say that a student is in equal footing with an artist, basically standing where the artist once stood, copying their objects, and maybe thinking about this idea of a genealogy. How can I pick up from what was made before me and now make anew? And it also not only happens visually, but happens verbally, in the discussions, in the critiques, in the analysis that happen in the gallery, the way in which one can have a conversation around an object. And so we've been thinking about this in three ways. One is, how do objects play a role in curriculum? How do they play a role in professional practice? In other words, how we're going to train our students to become members of various different professions. And also, how does a museum play a role in public engagement? In other words, the idea of higher education and its relationship to the public. So I'd like to give you a few Brown-focused examples. Here's an example of Lowry Marshall, who oversees a wonderful program in performance studies. And what's very famous is her art exercise, where students create an improv piece based on a work of art. And she does this by using a work of art in the museum. The students create their improv pieces and then perform it for the public. So on many different ways, they're adding an interpretation, often to very old works of art, which had never been interpreted in that way, and then performing it in public. Another example is working with Brown's medical school. One interesting thing we found is that the skills one uses to decipher an ailment in a patient are very similar to the skills one uses to understand a work of art. And so we've created an exercise by which every first-year medical student spends time in the museum going through an exercise that relies on describing what they see, deducing what it might mean, and then speculating interpretations. And this has been a wonderful way to have medical students work together and to understand the subjectivity of their analysis at times. Another example we found is very deep research that students can do, and Steve and Emily have given you examples of that as well. Here's an example of thesis research. Annika Finn is a student that will be graduating tomorrow, and for her thesis research she wanted to do a deep analysis of work of art. She also knew that she wanted to go into the field of conservation. And so we have many works of art that have not received the interpretation of the time that they deserve, including this Modigliani, that since the 1930s had been in storage because Alfred Barr, the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art, had said that it was a weak Modigliani. In other words, not necessarily a Modigliani that might be real. And so what's wonderful is Annika, through collaboration with our curators, through technical analysis, you're actually seeing an infrared scan of the Modigliani. She was able to detect the fact that not only could she trace exactly the provenance of the painting, but also begin to, through infrared reflectography, see the underdrawing and decipher that in fact the artist's hand was present. And she made such a compelling case that now we can bring this to the Modigliani authenticators to actually get it vouched for, and it will then go on view for the first time in about 90 years. So here's another wonderful example of students doing very deep research that is not only great for their careers, but actually already on the undergraduate level making contributions to the field. Another example is the way in which the museum space can be a site of research and performance. So Christopher Novello is a student who has graduated from Modern Culture and Media, and he has developed a code bending machine which takes data and then twists and turns it. And here you see him in our Impressionist galleries. He's taken a Monet, he's code bended it and created new works of art. And again, he's done this in public. You've seen a wonderful array of students, of docents, of faculty watching him work. And I think this is another wonderful aspect of public engagement, when students are enacting their work for the public. And then this concept of professional practice, because when one goes to college, one wants to have a job when you leave, and besides all the wonderful book learning and studying, it is wonderful to also be able to practice that. And so many Brown students do proctorships, practicums. We also have a gallery lecture program where we teach them how to speak publicly about their research, about works of art. And here you see Catherine Halsey, who's a PhD candidate in Egyptology, giving a wonderful lecture about fact and fiction in portraiture in the ancient world. And so this is another way in which the deep research taking place in higher education is shared immediately with the public. Another example is the collaboration that happens between RISD and Brown students. Here you see one of Steve Lubar students who is graduating, and Anya Ventura, working with a graphic designer at RISD, where they created an audio program for the museum's 6th floor, which you're welcome to go listen to, that tells the true stories of these objects. In other words, the interpretations that the museum does not offer, missing things that was found in the files, and it does so in a wonderful way that leaves us wondering, is this true? Is this false? Is this fiction? And it involves the public in their own meaning making from the objects. But this doesn't only happen on the student level, it also takes place with faculty. And just like Emily's example, it is inviting faculty to respond to objects. There's a program which we call Double Take, where we invite a Brown faculty and RISD faculty to offer their interpretations of objects. We don't let them discuss this beforehand, so it's basically a performance that happens on spot. So here you see Bill Miller, who teaches color theory at RISD, speaking with Bill Warren, who is a cognitive scientist at Brown, looking at a Monet. And what's wonderful about this is they offer their interpretations in front of an audience who then feels very empowered to contribute their interpretations as well. And so what gets created is this idea of an interpretive community where the deciphering of an object is happening in the moment, and it's a very exciting experience. So this is just one example. But it's also a place where the museum becomes a wonderful public setting. And here's Sarah and David Kay of Project Voice, who recently Sarah was just in a TED Talk. She's just also returned to Brown to do her Master of Teaching degree. But we had invited them very early on, I don't know what I've done here, to offer performance in the museum. And this, again, gave them a public forum to share their spoken word way of working that they hadn't yet had. So again, looking for these interstitial spaces that are both higher ed and public. And finally, this points to a collaboration with the Haffenreffer and the Joukowsky Center that we've been working on. And this is this idea of bringing careers to the public. So in this case, it's the idea of being an archaeologist in a program called Think Like an Archaeologist, which asks middle school students to use the same processes that an archaeologist uses to decipher objects. So you see Horace Ballard, who's a PhD candidate in American civilization here, working with students from the Nathan Bishop Middle School here in Providence, deciphering a wonderful ancient Greek piece we have. And what's wonderful is here, students in the middle school are using primary sources the same way a graduate student at Brown does. And it offers a wonderful, compelling model, not only what higher education might offer, but give them very important skills for the here and now. So I think many museums and higher ed have been fighting against this idea of how do we remain relevant. How are objects relevant when they're ready at anybody's fingertips? You can pull up any number of images. But what is the validity of studying from objects in the first person, if you will, and sharing that publicly? And it becomes a very compelling and generative model that I think the examples that you saw today really attest to. So thank you.
To the audience for comments or questions or suggestions? Anybody?
So tell me some more about the CultureLab and your graphology project and things like that. How does that fit into the Brown curriculum? Where is it housed? Who can take courses? Is it a part of another department, or does it exist across several arenas?
I'll talk, the CultureLab is part of the museum. So the museum is, in the administrative way, it reports to the provost, so it's across the university. Is very closely connected with the anthropology department, but also has strong connections with archaeology, American studies, history, Africana, history of art and architecture. Those are the main ones that we work closely with. But we're eager to work with everyone. One of the things that we've come to believe at the museum is that the artifacts can be useful across a whole range of departments and programs. And so we're trying to open it up and let everyone know that we're available. In fact, I've brought along, if anybody's interested, we just have a new folder out, new brochure, services for faculty at Brown and RISD. The notion is that we have lots of things that we can make available to faculty at both at Brown and RISD in almost every department.
To faculty only?
Well, this is a faculty brochure. We are eager to have students come as well. And of course, the museum is open to the public.
So the benefit of CultureLab is that it's part of the gallery over at Manning. And so you can tell students to go in at times when there is somebody there to supervise, but they're able to put on those white gloves and handle objects for your class. And so for my class on Native American Museum representations, the staff brought in probably 50 objects over the course of the semester from the facility out in Bristol, because it's a lot easier for them to go to someplace on campus than to get out to Bristol. And then they were able to examine these objects up close. So it was like having a mini portion of that museum in Bristol here on campus. And so we were able to talk about objects from different eras. And they were, that one picture that you saw when I was holding up the pair of quilled moccasins, they were able to pass those around. They're almost 200 years old. And you can see on the bottoms where the quill work is there, and there's actually dirt from the last person who wore them on these moccasins. And so they can sort of examine those and look at how people wore those and how they were use. So it's a way for students to be able to engage with these very old objects in some cases, right there in the gallery.
One of the things we're trying to do, which is a challenge, is if you have the opportunity to see the space, is it's quite a serious-looking space, which is partly what we want. We want to, sort of communicate about actually the serious research that university museums do on their objects. But at the same time, we want it to be accessible to the public. So one of the things we've been working on is how do we get the public, sort of people coming in off the street into the museum, into that space and feeling comfortable in that space, especially if there's somebody working there. So for example, Steve showed the photo of the two graduate students working on the Guatemalan textiles. And so we just made a sign saying, ask me about what I'm doing. So for anyone to come in, to feel that actually this is part of the museum's gallery, and we want you to come and engage with the research that's going on here. But that is a challenge. And also, it's important to point out, although while we're trying to sort of, the four of us here are working on trying to engage faculty and students across RISD and Brown, also visiting researchers. I mean, we've had the Haffenreffer, we just had somebody, is it University of California, Davis was visiting just a couple weeks ago looking at various objects. So certainly, I mean, academic museums are also very, very much trying to let other institutions know what is in our collections, what do we have here, so that people can come and use those as well. So it's sort of not only, but I think one of the big steps in trying to get oneself, sort of more known internationally is actually getting one's own faculty engaged and realizing that the museum is actually there and has lots of objects.
And to follow up, is the collection completely accessioned and documented, or are stored objects still in process? But my second question is any or all of your accessioned and documented collection online, but photographically, not just the data, but photographs, so that someone could go to Haffenreffer.com?
The answer is we are working on this. Museum cataloging and accessioning is endless. We have in the collections database that we have some information for 100,000 or so objects. Maybe 10,000 of them are well photographed. They're not yet online. One of the things that has been long and frustrating process for me as director has been choosing a new collections management system for the museum that will let us put everything online. We're pretty close to that. It is a difficult process. One of the things that we have been able to do is bring in students to work on cataloging and to improve the collections material we have. Museums always need to do more of that. So soon, I will say, a year from now, 6 months from now, I think we will probably be online. So check this out there.
Choose your software carefully.
This is the challenge.
It's been a very complicated process. The RISD Museum has just, in the process, I guess, has picked a new software and has been spending, what, a year or two switching over now?
Yes. So we required, what is wonderful is that there's new software that publishes collections directly online and just requires approval, but it's required converting from a very old, clunky database to a new database that then has this publishing capacity. And then I can't think of all the metadata and the tagging and so forth, but once one gets that process and system, I think it could be a game changer. I mean, most people have no idea what's in the RISD Museum or the Haffenreffer, but this is how we come to learn collections these days, and I think it's going to really, really shift how our collections are perceived and used.
One thing to follow up on that, the library has agreed, once we have our data available, to make it available through the library search as well. So that if a student is typing in, looking for something, looking for a book about something, the museum collections will show up as well. That apparently is easy to do now. Once we have our data available, they're eager to work with us. It's something we've thought a lot about and working very hard on, but it's like you say, it's a big decision. Many museums are trapped in this process right now.
We actually have to wrap up because they have another.
It seems to me to be a semiotic link. Many of the semiologists shown some interest in exploring what you're all doing.
I mean, I think this is from an outsider's point of view. Isn't modern culture and media what was the Department of Semiology? And so now we do find that Chris Novello, who was doing the code bending, he was in that department. I think he made things too much for that department. It was too tactile and concrete. But there, in terms of courses, we find that many courses do use the collection, because after all, if you're thinking about French theory or Merleau-Ponty's writing on Cézanne, why not look at Cézanne's apples to do so? But what's interesting with those faculty members, we've had to propose it and actually spend some time in front of those objects with them, working through the theoretical text to see the validity of the object through that. So it's been a really wonderful exercise, and I think it also speaks to the discipline that we've become there's almost about shift, if you will, from theory back to objects, and we're in a very interesting place where really intense theory can coexist with objects, and we're finding that working closely with faculty as well. But sometimes faculty's training have had nothing to do with objects, so why should they feel comfortable teaching from objects?